As we ask that the ancestors and the elders guide and watch over us, we do so knowing that people of African descent and Indigenous peoples have different but parallel histories on this continent. The brutality of colonialism has bound and shaped our cultures for over 500 years. If 2020 has taught us nothing else, it taught us that solidarity, one of the foundational principles of the labor movement, must exist within and between our two communities. John Lewis reminded us that when talking about solidarity with immigrant communities, that even though we arrived on these shores in different ships, we are all in the same boat now. Indigenous people do not come to this continent under the violent yoke of the transatlantic slave trade, but colonialism has shackled those First Nations for centuries in ways that are different to comprehend, and those effects we still see every single day. James Baldwin told us that they come for you in the morning, we can be damn sure that they'll be coming for us in the evening. 6 days into 2021, I'm sure we remember that day. We're brutally reminded of this. Make no mistake, they are coming for us. In our work as activists, being prepared is key. When you stay ready, you never have to get ready. And this time, we are more ready than ever. We will not let the violence of poverty or inequity of education, housing, and healthcare on First Nations continue unchallenged. We will not let Indigenous communities stand alone in their struggle for clean water, land rights, or simple human dignity. We are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we are not going back. Over to you, Isabelle.
So I have the CBTU's statement of recognition for the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. In 2013, the General Assembly of the United Nations declared January 1st, 2015 to December 31st, 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. The theme of the decade is, quote, People of African Descent, Recognition, Justice, and Development. Given the existence of slavery in Canada from the 16th century to 1834 and ongoing inequalities and injustices towards people of African descent, we acknowledge the importance of this decade. This decade is an opportunity to celebrate and recognize the important contributions made by people of African descent to our union and society, and to work towards reparations and justice. Following consultations, a United Nations working group of experts drafted a clear list of recommendations to address structural barriers faced by people of African descent across Canada. These recommendations can guide us in our work as activists. We will work to combat anti-Black racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms of oppression. No one is free until we are all free. With this, I bring you back to Yolanda.
Thank you so much, Isabelle. Like I said before, for those of you that are just joining us, welcome to our event tonight, our speaker series and events. This will be one out of, I've stopped counting now, one out of many speaker series that we have. We'll be doing something every week for the next 2 months. For those of you that this is your first time, that said this is your first webinar, I already said, welcome. And this is one of many. And for sure, you're gonna get an email. So next week when you come on, don't say it'll be your first, you'll be a rookie by then. So we want you to participate with us, and we want to start off with our evening, of course, our first one tonight. And I want to introduce to you amazing sister of mine, Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, an educator, journalist, and a community activist living in the African Nova Scotia. I know, I am waiting to see you in person because I want to give you a hug. She was the 5th poet of Halifax in 2016. Elle was a recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work and work in prison justice. She is a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with incarcerated people on CKDU that creates space for people inside to share their creative work and discuss contemporary social and political issues. And along with this work, she supports women in Nova Scotia institution in writing and sharing their voices. For our kickoff, I want to welcome Elle Jones.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Yolanda. I wish I could give you a hug as well, but you know, COVID keeps people apart. And thank you, Denise, as well, for organizing, and everybody who has organized. I was asked for a poem about ancestors to kick this off in the spirit of Black History Month. This poem is centered on the Africville community, but I'm sure people can extrapolate that into your own communities as well. For those who don't know, of course, Africville, the Black community that was bulldozed and attempted erasure in the 1960s in Halifax. So this is about the struggle of Africville and also our continued fight. My people, take heed how their plans do proceed. If you don't want Black people to breed, then you don't let them read. And when a people can't read, then they can't sign the deed, and then you can take whatever you need. Take their land with no fee. They don't have to agree, and you can just claim whatever you steal, or maybe a place for their pets to go pee, and they run around the park while Black people ain't free. If they build a place to pray, bulldoze it away. If they gather to learn, then let it all burn. Don't give them cash, dump your trash, and whatever they ask, tell them people like them just aren't up to the task. Don't give them jobs, watch them rob, give them guns, watch the fun, watch their grandmothers sob, jail them all when you're done. Don't give them seeds, let them bleed, deprivation's the key. Let them clean, screen them out, don't let them get a degree. Move in, build the condos and force them to leave, and whatever they achieve, find a way to go thieve. They're not homes, they're just shacks. There's no home when you're Black, and in their backyard, run the railroad tracks. Don't give them no services, though they pay tax. Make them walk behind you with a weight on their back. And when they die, put their bodies away in the back. Garbage trucks are good enough for their stuff when they pack, so don't let them relax. Let them work till they crack, and crack down on them. Say that they pimp and sell crack. Relocate them by sewage and by the smokestacks. And when they become numbers and stats, tell them that's just the fact. They don't know why we won't die, but we're strong. We've survived, and with all that they've tried to rule and divide, to control and deprive, but they haven't succeeded. In fact, we just rise like a garden they've weeded, like a forest revives once the fire's receded. They tell us we're inferior, we've never believed it. Judged by our skin and not our interiors, against the odds, plus with God we're never defeated. With their greed we've been cheated, just look how we're treated. Slavery and Jim Crow, it's always repeated, and yet with our sweat, with our faith and our blood, if they don't pay the debt, they can't hold back the flood. Did you see us this summer all over their streets? But don't be fooled, we're not cool staying down on our knees. This is land that we're owed, and we're not saying please and apologies, no. They are never enough, and no, not fake churches, we're calling your bluff. Give us land, reparations, we want back our stuff. Or did you forget that our people are tough? And there's new generations, and they're coming up. And do you see our elders, the looks on their faces? So don't play your games with your cash and suitcases, with your maps. We're Black people, you try to erase us. All this spirit, it never has faded. And we won't be persuaded. Too long we have waited. Justice won't be denied, even though you've delayed it. And maybe we marched it, or maybe we prayed it, but the arc of the universe always is weighted to justice, to freedom. It bends. We can make it. We've already come through the destruction and hatred. And I know their sundial don't catch the sun with the way it's positioned, but we all know what time it is. Don't get it twisted in all your statistics. The addicted, afflicted, convicted, kicked down, victimized on assistance. We're not how we're depicted. We're not afraid now. I don't know how you've missed it. And the blood in our veins is a powerful liquid. And when you see us out here all clapping and singing, you can hear the church bell that will always be ringing. It will always be ringing with the songs of the field. And we're all standing up from the places we've kneeled. And our faith is our shield and our spines made of steel. We've been raised in the dark. We're strategic and patient. And the spark in our eyes is pure determination. Our ancestors have put you on notification. We won't stop till you give us our full reparations.
I want to see them in the chat. See them in the chat. Incredibly powerful. Bravo, bravo. Thank you so much, Elle. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The chat is blowing up. This is it, this is it. I know you can feel the love in the room just by the chat, so thank you so much.
I just need to say, Elle, I've done, I don't know, 40 Zooms since January 1st, and they haven't been any tears since then. So I thank you.
And I want to shout out, of course, all the elders in my community who taught me. Lynn Jones for the reparations work, of course. Everybody, I'm sure, knows Sister Lynn and her incredible work. So I have to shout her out when I talk about reparations. But that's for the elders in our community in particular who have suffered the worst and kept going. So thank you.
Absolutely. We so need you and our sisters like Lynn. And the important work that you're doing makes us even stronger. And while you have folks, shoulders that you lean on, we definitely lean on yours for your expertise every day. And I know that you know that, so thank you. Thank you. Blessings. I now want to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening. But before I introduce her, I just want to give folks a bit of maybe some information while we're doing some chatting on the chat line. I want you to know that before I introduce Emilie, and she's going to give a full presentation, she's going to talk you through her presentation and get you to talk on the chat also, but there will be an opportunity after for other questions and answers if you don't get to ask them during the presentation. And I know that Isabelle will help facilitate some of that in the discussion. So just so you know, there's lots of time to talk to folks and be a part of the conversation during this next process. Emilie Nicolas is an esteemed journalist and columnist with Le Devoir and a frequent media commentator, analyst, public speaker, educator, and consultant on public policy, equity, human rights, international cooperation, race and gender issues. How she has time for us, God only knows, but we're happy to have her. She's a regular contributor to the CBC's Power and Politics and Let's Go, as well as CTV's Power Play, and has been published in several journals, magazines, and newspapers, both in French and English. Most recently, Emilie won the Quebec's cultural magazine, SODEP 2020 Excellence Award for the best essay for a piece in Revue Liberté. Over to you, Emilie. I know you're out there somewhere. Welcome and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction. I don't even know, I'm still caught, and I think many of you guys must also be caught on just the emotion of what Elle just shared. I'm seeing bonjour in the chat, hi. First of all, can you just tell me, Yolanda, if the translation is now working? So can I freestyle in franglais?
Denise, just give me 1 second. Let me just talk to Denise.
We can hear you. Just maybe perhaps speak up a little louder and go for it Montreal style, maybe French and English, and then Isabelle can jump in if need be for now.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, I've raised my mic's volume to the maximum, so we'll try to do with that, and I'll try to speak as much as possible. Bonjour Daniel, bonjour, hi everybody who's in the chat. Sorry for the technical difficulties and for the time that's passing with that, but I feel first of all honored and blessed to be here. And I think, before we were starting this webinar, we were actually, I was actually speaking with the organizer, and then Elle arrived, and I think it's important to note that this is an all-women organized event, and that there's power to starting Black History Month that way. It's really, I think, important to note. Je pense aussi que c'est important de nommer le fait qu'on est en train de parler de l'histoire du Québec et du Canada quand on parle de l'histoire des Noirs. there's a lot of erasure in our history. And I think that's why so many of us are curious to attend this kind of webinar. It's like we crave as adults the kind of learning and knowledge that we've never, been able to access when we were younger. So before I go to just start the presentation, I just want to let you know that I'm one of those multitasker millennials who's actually able to follow what's going on in the chat as I speak. And I think we're all tired of Zooms. So if you could actually, ask your questions in the chat or in the Q&A while I speak, I'll try to also like pause and I think it's interesting when there's like those kind of interactions rather than me speaking in the screen and then you guys reserving all of your questions for the end and then there's no time and you're kind of frustrated with that. So I'll try to do my best to make this as interactive as possible. The first thing I want to say about Black history, and it's going to sound very obvious, but it's just a couple of key points. First of all, Black history is world history. And it's important to say that just because the way that we're taught history most of the time, there are those borders, which are lines that we draw on a map or that have been drawn for us on the map. And we're supposed to read and approach history as if, everything that is going on inside those lines matter. And if it's going on outside those lines, it's not relevant. It's not our quote unquote history, right? And so that interaction with nationalism and history doesn't make sense in general, but I think it's especially harmful when you're trying to make sense of what is the history of Black people in the world. We don't obey those borders. We don't obey those lines that's been drawn on our land. They don't necessarily they cannot help us, tell our own lives properly. And so I think it's really important to just, first of all, acknowledge that. What I mean by that is that most of the time, first, when we start talking about Black history, we start talking about slavery, and that's also an issue. There's a whole lot of things that have happened to our people way before that. And of course, we all know that, but I don't think we often take the time to know that, like in our heart, know that. And so, of course, all of those cultures and empires and civilizations in the continent, and also the fact that even if we're going to go and talk about the slave trade and all of that, just an acknowledgement that as well, this is something that goes back, 1,000 years and not 500 years or even more. And something that was also going on in the Arab Empire as well. And so just to acknowledge that when we're trying to take, pride in our history and all of that, there's a lot that's been accomplished, but a lot of that has been accomplished while there's also this millennia old history of trying to disrupt our communities on the continent itself. The other thing that I think is important to acknowledge about Black history, that first of all is it's world history, but it's always been about as well global capitalism. What I mean by that is that, from the get-go, I'm of Haitian origin, and I started when I start, my first interest in Black history was always rooted in Haitian history, and I've been reading a lot of Haitian scholars who always, root our history in an international network of trade and resistance and alliance. Oftentimes when we talk about globalization, we talk about it as if this was, a new phenomenon. Well, the reality is that when you look at the history of Black folks and how we've been displaced from one place or another, then you see that the root of this economic system has always been, international. It's always been transatlantic, and that's kind of why we were created as a people. One of the key aspects of that created us as Black people that we often not necessarily learn about in school is this whole notion of actually theological debates that happened in the church, right, with the Pope and drinks in Spanish society, actually way back in the days in the 1400s, when they were trying to establish themselves in the Caribbean. And what happened is you had basically debates between people who were having different point of view in terms of how they would organize colonies in the Americas. On one hand, you had a person like Bartolomé de las Casas, who was trying to say that basically Indigenous people had souls, therefore they should be, Christianized and not be taken into slavery. And then you had another person, Luis de Civil Beda, who was saying, no, they have no souls. And they argued. And basically the result of that is that the Pope decided that yes, Indigenous people have souls, so it's wrong to take them into slavery, but then Black people don't. And so that's accelerated actually our presence on this continent. And I think it's also important to remember that, because a lot of us obviously have, spirituality is really important to us, but just to understand as well that at the core of our identity and how they've been, constructed on this continent, on this land, there are also those, really intense discussions that have taken place over history that have basically decided our faith and our fate as a people. So the two of them intertwine. What I want to say that's about Canadian history that's related to what I've just said, first of all, is that when we talk about Canadian history, as I was saying, we're all focused on the borders, we're all focused on the nation, while really the truth of Canadian history is that it's a history, first and foremost, it's a history of empire. What that means is that there are two empires that basically constructed this country. You have France and you have the British, and the two argued with each other. But what that means is that when you look at the place and the space that people have been occupied in, the policies that have shaped the lives of Black folks in here, Canada, what you have is basically those politics of empire, where you have goods, you have wealth, you have politics, you have economic policies that are being moved around. Basically what it creates is an ecosystem where if you're only trying to make sense of what's going on in Canada to understand what the Black history in Canada, you're missing on a lot of things. You're missing, for example, of how Saint-Domingue, and which is now Haiti, and Martinique and Guadeloupe and all, and Louisiana and all of those places were part of the same political entity that Quebec now is today, and that the slavery that was going on over there has an impact on the money and the establishment of the people who were living in a place like Quebec City or Montreal during the French regime. If you don't acknowledge that Canada is also just a tiny corner, not the most interesting one actually, of the British Empire, then you also fail to acknowledge all the money that came also from the Caribbean to Canada right from the foundation of the colony. And I think that's important to stress that, because most of the time, especially those of us who have roots in the Caribbean, we try to make those connections as if there were news, that is something that dates back to the 50s and the 60s. While really, when you look at the really old money in this country, you can see how all of those things were always connected. An example that I think is important to give is, for example, Prince Rupert, which is the founder of the Hudson Bay Company. He was a prince of the British Crown. He made his money in Africa with the slave trade there, and then he was appointed to Canada and was given this land, Rupert's land, right, which is most of Western Canada today. And this is how the slave trade industry was, organized by the British Empire, basically. And so if you're only looking at it from a very narrow, territorially conscripted lens, you're missing out on a lot of those things. You're missing out, for example, on all of those really old families in Montreal who had connections, for example, with the sugar industry down south, and then came up north to Montreal, and then that's when they had the factories, right, for the transformation. So when you look at the industrialization of Montreal, a lot of the raw goods were also coming from our families who are our ancestors down south, right? So it's just trying to move both people seen as not fully people, labor and goods and chattel, and all of that shapes what we are today. And it definitely shapes, both people who have roots on this land that date 2 or 3 generations, but also some of us who might have roots on this land that date back, you know, a lot longer than that. I think it's also, when we do a history like that, we also start seeing a lot more clearly that when we talk about Canada's relationship with Indigenous people and the policies that were made in place to assimilate and settle you know, Indigenous people into reservations, a lot of that. If you understand that Canada is just a little corner of the British Empire, you understand that all of those policies are put in place at the same time as other people in other corners of the British Empire are doing that same thing in Africa, are doing that same thing in other colonies that are also possessed by the British Empire, right? And so you're not just then in alliance with Indigenous people in a way that is understood if you don't know that. You're also just, you know, your ancestors have survived basically very similar histories, both in Canada in terms of how Black folks have been, you know, treated in this country, but also because you're not obeying basically this order of seeing Canada as just like this place on the map, rather than seeing it as a trade, as a knot of power, basically, that reaches across continents, and is part of basically you know, Western imperialism. So I think it's really important to, you know, say those things, and that's definitely not how we're going to be usually taught Black history in schools. J'aimerais partager, is the interpretation working? J'aimerais partager.
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Not yet.
So j'aimerais partager quelque chose, and then I'm going to repeat it in English, whereas how we're going to do it. J'aimerais partager différents exemples de la façon dont cet effacement-là, tant territorial que idéologique, a un rôle dans nos vies quotidiennes. Un exemple que je donne souvent, c'est la place, l'effacement de l'histoire de l'esclavage au Québec. Par exemple, moi, je suis allée à l'école secondaire dans le Vieux-Québec, puis en fait, le terrain de basket de mon école secondaire est l'ancien lieu où il y a eu les fondations de la première maison du premier settler de la Nouvelle-France, donc du premier colon de la Nouvelle-France, et donc aussi du premier maître d'esclaves de la Nouvelle-France. Donc cette personne-là, cet Africain-là, s'appelait Olivier Lejeune. Il n'y a aucun signe encore aujourd'hui sur le terrain de basket qui dit que c'est là qu'a vécu finalement Olivier Lejeune. La seule chose qu'on voit, c'est le nom de la personne qui a possédé Olivier Lejeune. Donc, moi-même, en étant à Québec, en train d'essayer de comprendre ma place au Canada, il y a déjà cet effacement-là. La seule raison pour laquelle j'ai appris que c'était là physiquement que ça avait eu lieu, c'est parce que mon ami Webster, qui fait des tours guidés sur l'histoire des Noirs, a pris le temps de retracer ça. Puis c'est grâce à son militantisme que maintenant on va travailler peut-être à avoir cette plaque-là, donc de la ville de Québec. One of the examples that I often give when I give conference on like the importance of erasure of Black history, for example, my high school in Quebec City is in the old part of the city, and actually the basketball field of my high school is where you used to have the foundations of the first house of the first permanent settler, European settler of New France. And that person, Guillaume Couillard, happens to be also the first slave owner of New France, and the enslaved African that he was an owner of is Olivier Lejeune. And so this person, there is actually no, sign. There's nothing that says that this person actually spent their life here, and they're probably one of the first, Black people to ever set foot in that territory that is now New France, after Mathieu d'Acosta, who was an interpreter that accompanied Samuel de Champlain, right? So there's no sign of that, historical Black presence at all. And the only reason I've learned that right myself way after I've graduated high school is because Webster, who's a friend of mine, who's a historian, is doing those guided tours in Quebec City to say that those are, you know, the places where Black people were enslaved, and those were the places where Black people lived. And those are, so if it wasn't for that, you know, activist historian effort to take people places, I myself, as a person who graduated from the school, who spent years, you know, doing my phys ed classes there, would have not known the history of the land I was standing on, right? And so that's just one example of how much that erasure, and we can talk about erasure, you know, all night, of all the things that we should know about Black history that we don't, but because we have so limited time, I think that's the one thing I want to insist of, is that there's so many things in your life that you don't know that there were Black people there before. You don't know what the history of the land that you're on and its relationship to Black history. And it's actually having an impact on how you feel you belong to places or not, and how you see yourself in this country, and how you see yourself, you know, being able to enter or not some places. Another example of that erasure that really had an impact on my life, I was nominated a couple of years ago for a Governor General Award in the commemoration of the person's case, it's called, which is something that you give every year to people who've been involved in feminist activism. This was in relationship to what I did, you know, to fight the Charter of Quebec value back when, which is now Bill 21. But that award is given in commemoration of 5 women who basically were instrumental in advancing women's rights, is how we are told in Canada. And they actually have their statues on the House of Commons, right? The famous 5. But amongst those famous 5, you have women who have actually not only fought for having the right for women in Canada to have the right to vote, but also fought for not every woman in Canada to have the right to vote, right? Those were really actually white supremacist, racist women. And one of them, for example, Emilie Nicolas, fought and actually won. She battled for the right for Alberta, which is where she comes from, to have laws in place that would force the sterilization of Indigenous women, Black women, basically women who were not white, and also women who had disabilities, women who had mental health issues. However, that was understood at the beginning of the 20th century, right? And so you have this woman responsible for the forced sterilization of Black women and Indigenous women in Canada, who has her statue, right, on the House of Commons. And here you have myself and others trying to be, you know, given awards, whatever, for international feminism. And we have no, and I'm standing there taking a picture, having no idea of who that person is. Why? Not because I'm stupid, because like many of us, it's only after the fact when things are brought up, because you have those, you know, scholars who are really up there and trying to tell us those things. We certainly do not learn about Emilie Nicolas in Quebec. I had no idea who the woman was, right? And so it's only after the fact that we figure out, you know, what's up and what we're actually, you know, being a part of, and what that the symbol of those images are. Sorry, I'm being distracted by the chat. Yeah, one person is saying that there's a hallway named after her in the elementary school. I would not be surprised. There's a lot of activism that was made. Some of it is Ottawa based to make those people really, really celebrated across Canada. I'm not saying that they did not, in fact, you know, push some law that was a step in terms of women being able to vote. I'm just saying that we don't know the whole story, and because we don't know the whole story, it's actually really complicated to celebrate them instead of just acknowledging that they existed. A third example that I'm going to give about that, just recently as well, I was invited to stay over at a house that's owned by the Jeanne Sauvé Foundation. And there was a lot of us who were staying there, many of us who are Black, and we were there, invited to be there because of the work we've been doing around human rights and anti-racism some of them in the Caribbean, some of them on the African continent as well. And it was just 2 weeks ago that we found out actually that Jeanne Sauvé's husband had been an activist against the end of apartheid in South Africa. Like, that never made the official history. And actually we found that out because of you know, historians sharing their research on social media, and not only explaining how that is true, but also how there was basically a campaign to make sure that this knowledge would not be part of the legacy of how we remember this former Governor General, right? And so everywhere that you find, that you go in this country, you're gonna find people who are celebrated, who have that history of anti-Black racism that's been erased from their public legacy, because we want to be able to honor them. By we, I mean people who identify with them, and they feel like if we were to tell the truth, basically, it would be an attack on Canadian identity and Canadian pride. And so there's always that additional burden for us to be able to, you know, find the truth for ourselves. And I'm not saying this in a conspiracy theory way. I'm saying this in a, you know, there are obviously researchers out there already doing the work. There's also a lot of knowledge that are within the communities, a lot of oral history, people that have passed on the actual events of what's been going on. But I just think that it's important to, you know, acknowledge that a lot of that is not necessarily accessible, you know, in terms of general culture that everybody would have, and that's an issue, but that's not an accident. It's something that is intrinsic to how Canadian nationalism was built. And before I go into that, I want to take a pause and see if there are any questions, and also be able to take some water.
Emilie, I just want to say that we have translation now.
Ah, super.
And thank you, merci beaucoup to ELC.
While you're taking a sip of water, so I can give them the instructions really quickly.
Yeah.
Just for those that came on later to the webinar, I just want folks to know that you have at the bottom right hand of your screen, you have an interpretation icon for those of you that are on your laptop or tablet. The bottom right, interpretation. If you want to hear the language in English, you press the English button. In French, you press the French button. For those of you that came on later, we now have interpretation. Thanks for your patience on this. I'm going to ask Isabelle if she can say it in French really quickly to help. And then Emilie, I hope that was a long enough little commercial break.
Yes,
You're doing
actually.
Excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, Isabelle.
Thank you. Alors, pour ceux qui viennent de se joindre à nous, vous avez l'option maintenant de traduction, ça fonctionne, hurrah! Alors, vous allez au bas de l'écran et vous allez choisir la langue d'interprétation francophone, si vous préférez juste en français, ou si vous êtes bilingue et que vous voulez juste choisir aucune option, comme ça vous allez simplement pouvoir écouter la présentation dans la langue dans laquelle elle est donnée. Donc, quand on passe de français à anglais à franglais, vous allez tout l'entendre pareil. Donc, pour ceux qui ont un cellulaire, il y a une option de plus d'options au bas de l'écran pour aller choisir le langage d'interprétation. Et pour ceux qui sont par ordinateur, c'est une option déjà au bas de l'écran. Je vois franglais pour moi, s'il vous plaît. Oui, parfait, pas de problème. Just before we go back, Emilie, there were a few questions that came up in terms of just names that people didn't catch because it went a little quickly. So if you could just repeat, there were two names. It's further up in the questions, or if you want, we can go and dig out the statements for you. And also, just to remind everybody that there is going to be a Q&A towards the end, but every once in a while, I think Emilie's going to want one of these water breaks as well. So we might just jump into some questions in between. so that it kind of breaks it up a little bit for her as well. Alors, vas-y, Emilie.
Merci, Isabelle. Je vais faire un petit bout en français, donc mettez votre traduction. C'est l'heure de faire l'exercice. So just switch to interpretation for this little while. Je vois des gens dans le chat qui parlent de l'effacement de l'histoire de l'esclavage, mais aussi, je pense qu'il y a quelqu'un dans le chat qui spécifie l'importance aussi de l'esclavage des personnes autochtones au Canada. Puis je pense en fait que les deux vont ensemble, au sens où, premièrement, quand on regarde la façon dont l'histoire du Canada a été écrite, le premier historien reconnu, disons, du Canada français s'appelle François-Xavier Garneau. Puis, il a écrit son livre « L'histoire du Canada français » dans les années 1830, juste quelques années après, 1840, juste quelques années après l'abolition de l'esclavage. Donc, lui-même avait la mémoire vivante, puis il y avait plein de personnes autour de lui qui se rappelaient de l'esclavage. Mais dans son livre, l'esclavage a été complètement minimisé, tant envers les personnes noires que les personnes autochtones. Donc, les gens, après ça, ont bâti leur histoire du Canada, leur histoire de la Nouvelle-France en ayant François-Xavier Garneau comme principale source. Donc, je pense que c'est important aussi de le mentionner parce que souvent, quand on parle de l'effacement, on parle comme si c'était comme juste « Ah, il y a eu un effacement ». Ça part aussi, simplement, des fois, ça peut être des individus qui, eux, ont été beaucoup, en fait, critiqués à leur propre époque. François-Xavier Garneau a beaucoup été critiqué pour l'effacement qu'il a fait de l'esclavage par des gens qui savaient ça et qui savaient que c'était pas honnête. Mais on a retenu ce nom-là, ce livre-là, puis à cause de ça, il y a eu un effacement qui s'est perpétué. Un autre aspect aussi qui est important de parler pour, par exemple, l'histoire de l'effacement, qui est super intéressant. J'ai plusieurs livres que je voulais vous montrer. Par exemple, Frank McKay, Black Then, Blacks in Montreal. Vous voyez donc le titre du livre. Frank McKay wrote a lot about basically he wrote a couple of biographies of Black folks who were in Canada during that period, especially in Montreal and in Quebec. And when you see that actually there are some folks who were there at that period who were basically caught in between, you know, l'arbre et l'Écosse, as I would say, they were caught between a place and a heart. I don't know how you say the expression in English, but basically caught in a crossfire between American politics and British politics and Quebec politics. Which is, I guess, the story of my life and a lot of us still today, where you had basically people who were here because slavery was still legal in the United States, and they were using Canada as a place to fight history from, slavery from. And as a result of that, they were basically ad hoc allies to the British Empire. While, for example, in Quebec, you had the Patriots rebellion that was taking place. And those were people who were really inspired by Republican ideas, both in Quebec and in Ontario, who wanted to have a responsible government, so to have a House of Commons that would be elected by the people in provincial parliaments, and they wanted all of that, and also were inspired by republics such as the United States of America, right? And so you had a lot of Black folks in Montreal who were distrustful of those, basically how they're seen now is as ancestors of Quebecois nationalists. And because of that distrust, because of their admiration for the American Empire, you had, you know, Quebecois hero Louis-Joseph Papineau writing letters back in his, you know, later days when the secession war is going on in the US, saying that if a person like Andrew you know, the great Republicans in the United States are able to be Republicans and slave owner. It means that slave ownership is not incompatible with with the idea of republicanism. A lot of them were also talking about maybe joining the United States if things wouldn't work out for them within the British Empire. And so a lot of Black people here were not okay with that, and they fought against that. And so obviously when then you tell people from a Quebec nationalist history, you don't want to necessarily remember those folks, right? And so there's also erasure that comes from when you're always trying to tell story from the perspective of a romantic, you know, heroic narrative about it. That's just an example about Quebec, but it can be as well definitely about, you know, loyalists coming up in Nova Scotia or in Ontario as well. There's always this kind of narrative of how, you know, people fought hard to settle those lands and that they were loyal to whatever ideals, and this is how this country was created as this tolerant and fair place and all of that. Whenever you have people who don't fit that narrative, and usually it's most of our communities because we're kind of like the oddball out there that isn't about any of that, then obviously there's going to be an erasure as well, because it's the truth is in the way of the myth that we're trying to create for ourselves. Je vois aussi des questions. Quelqu'un qui demande, je me demande si on apprend à l'école qu'il y a eu de l'esclavage ici et si oui, depuis quand? La plupart du temps, quand on apprend sur l'histoire de l'esclavage, puis Richard aussi, Gaboton, allô Richard, qui pose une question aussi sur la stratégie.
About the strategy of teaching history. Most of the time when we teach about slavery, if we do teach it, it's very new. Most of the time it's a whole tradition of minimizing and to say, for example, there was slavery in the United States and in Canada, it's a marginal one and it's okay. It's not really a bad slavery. I don't know what it's about when we say that it's okay that it's that type of in Canada. And also we have to add that that way of teaching slavery comes from historians who named the history of slavery in Canada. And it's been only more, it's, you know, Black historians answer those historians. So the values, those stories on the history are changing. But often we presented Canadian slavery as a slavery that was okay. The reason for that is that most of the economy back then was a fur trade. And most people who were in slavery were working as the help in homes. We could make another argument if slavery was not part fundamentally of the economic structure. It means that rather than morally, it's even more somber, because it's as if you have slavery for the fun of it, because it's really unique, that debate about the right slavery versus the wrong one. We talk about, when we talk about slavery in Canada, in Ontario, often what we want to do is that we want to separate ourselves from slavery. And the role of the South of Ontario as being a territory that allowed some people to come here and go back to the United States. We talk about it as if the Underground Railroad, but there were slaves in Ontario who had to try to get their freedom in the north of the United States, and it was more complex. The history of segregation in Ontario itself is complex. It takes, as in Quebec, people or societies, Black communities have to organize themselves so that that story could be told.
In the chat, do you hear me?
I'm hearing you well. I think that maybe there were a few times where the volume was a little bit lower, but so far I see a lot of oui ça va and yes, it's good. So keep going. We're good.
Okay, I'm seeing another question as well about further readings and things that people can learn about what I just mentioned. I just mentioned Frank McKay, this book. There's also Done with Slavery by the same author, who talks specifically about the first generation after the abolition of slavery in Canada, because there's often as well this gap. It's like, yeah, we tell, yeah, slavery existed in Canada, and then we're like, most of us, except in Nova Scotia, are second and third, first, second, third generation. And so there are obviously communities that are much older than that, in both in Southern Ontario and Montreal and in the prairies and everywhere. But there's that, that reality as well, that a lot of us are first, second, and third generation. And so for those of us for whom that's the situation, there's a question of why, like, where are those folks that are actually descended from, folks who've been in Canada forever, especially when you're outside of Nova Scotia, right? That's often a question that folks have. And so you have that the people basically been trying to look into the biography of the folks who were there, for example, in the 19th century, and what they were up to and the communities that they created and the communities that were erased as well. Elle mentioned Africville, which is really, really important. But there's also, for example, here in Montreal, there's also similar erasure of Black neighborhoods that were bulldozed, for example, Little Burgundy partially bulldozed to make way for the highway, the l'autoroute Ville-Marie au centre-ville de Montréal, which really just shrinked Little Burgundy. There's the Negro Community Center, which is, more than a century old, who was also destroyed a couple of years ago, who's basically a heritage building downtown Montreal as well. So that erasure and then that displacement as well, that comes with, gentrification and all of that, but it's just that and also just the shrinking of space, qui fait que les gens s'en vont dans des quartiers, par exemple, comme Indigi, ou s'en vont dans la communauté anglophone historique de Montréal.
There's the
S'acheter,
where they could still rent apartments that are accessible. But in the end, the historical heart in Old Montreal of people who were there in the 18th and 19th century takes people on the site or historians to talk about it.
During the summer, there's Hito Joseph, who's doing in Montreal what Webster is doing in Quebec City that I mentioned. So he's doing both tours, both in the Old Montreal and in Little Burgundy, to talk about that history that is present in our city that's been erased, but that through oral history, through those tours, you can actually see all the different sites that are important to our communities. That sometimes the folks are still there, sometimes the folks have been displaced, but if we remember our ancestors and remember our elders and what they fought for, then their work and their lives and their life's work, is still alive. Are there any more questions that I can go to, or should I just continue? Other books. I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation about the role of the Caribbean and Black history as, it's always been a global economy that we've been at the center of. And that globalization's always been a process that's been affecting our life. One book that I find really helpful to just talk about that is Michel Trujillo, who's a Haitian anthropologist, so Global Transformation. You can also look that up. I think it's a really interesting book. I don't want to talk about Nova Scotia too much because Elle is listening and she knows so much more than I can ever discuss. And there's so many sources that she has. Obviously, if you haven't read Robbins Maynard's book, that's always a great starting point if you want to know more. Policing Black Lives. Yay, other book says Nathan Beausoleil. Yes, I love books. So that's really just should be on everybody's hands in terms of getting, you know, the 101, even 201, 301 history of where we are and why all of that is, you know, is hard. It's hard to tell. It's very political for that truth to get out there. Another book about slavery in Montreal that I think is really important is The Hanging of Angelique by Aphoi Cooper. And so she's a prof that's been basically, it's both, you know, giving you the facts about history, but it's also basically doing the written version of a historical recreation that you could see sometimes in like docufiction. So basically telling the story of that woman who was accused of burning down the city of Montreal while she was being enslaved, and she actually had to give her life for that. And so how, you know, and not just talking about her, but talking about the institutions that were around her at the time in New France that made, you know, that shaped her history. And the erasure, obviously, of Angelique as a person. So yeah, so those are some interesting books about that period of history. And before we go to, because I'm seeing time fly, to more questions, the last part that, you know, I wanted to get to was this notion of the Canadian state as a place where telling Black history is always going to be inherently political. I mean, we've known since the, well, for a long time, but just with the, for example, the toppling of Stady that's happened this summer, there's been a whole debate that started again about, you know, Johnny Mcdonald and his place as the father of the Confederation. Johnny Mcdonald was making speeches in the House of Commons about white supremacy and about the superiority of the Aryan race. There's a lot of historians actually who are debating whether or not when he said that, talking about the Canadian Confederation rather than Federation, wasn't that a nod to the American Confederacy? Who, you know, who was just happening basically, who the Civil War, the American Civil War was taking place just 2 years after, before the Confederation of Canada. And Johnny Mcdonald was a well-known supporter of the Southern, you know, slave owners in the United States. And so just the fact that we're talking about the Confederation of Canada is something. There's also, but just in these speeches, how he would basically say that the United States, their issue was that there were already too many Black people there. Now that they had abolished slavery, they were caught with what we called at the time the Negro problem, right? What do we do with those folks? And so, but Canada had a smaller Black population, a smaller Chinese population as well, that was brought from that Hong Kong, which is this other corner of the British Empire. It had just, you know, it was a more white space at the time for many reasons. And the goal, the goal politically very explicit was to keep Canada as white as possible and make it basically a land that would succeed in creating basically Aryan supremacy in the way that the United States was not as well positioned to do so. So there was an explicit intention that led to, of course, you know, what we've known with the politics and the praise against First Nations, you know, and Métis and the residential school system and all of that. But it was also a politics that definitely made sure that, you know, if African Americans were trying to come up to Canada, that would be difficult, and those who were here would be made feel definitely unwelcome as well. And so while you had during that second half of the 19th century, the KKK developing in the United States, they also had chapters here in Canada who were targeting Indigenous people, Black folks, French Canadian, Catholics, a little bit of everything, but really to just making sure that Black people would not feel welcome here. You also had now I'm skipping to the early, 20th century, prime minister like Wilfred Lahir, the first French Canadian prime minister, who was there, who was, felt like also that Black people don't belong in Canada. So he started basically a policy. He wanted that to be officially in writing, a policy that would make sure that Black people could not come to Canada. But, even at the time didn't fly so well. And so what he did instead is send border agents and messengers, emissaries to the United States to tell African Americans that basically the Canadian climate was hostile to their genes and that they should not come here. They would also corrupt medical officers responsible for making sure that people were fit to come and immigrate to Canada, make sure that they would not let Black folks and people of color come into the country as well. And so for the first half of the 20th century as well, the idea that Canada is white and should remain white was also very much an official policy. And so when we talk about, as well, segregation being an American reality, we often don't know that in Canada, for example, what you had, instead of having, Jim Crow system and the official signs that said this is for colored and this is for white, what you had instead is that people were basically designing the same system, but using business owners' right and property rights as a way to go around it. Business freedom of business, basically. You have very famous law cases at the beginning of the 20th century where you have Black patrons trying to be served, for example, at the whole forum here in Montreal with the Montreal Habs, watch the hockey game and then have a beer, and basically the owner refusing them to be served, and the courts in Canada saying that the owner is right to refuse Black people to be served, because as a business, you're free to decide which client you want to serve and not serve. And so it's okay for businesses to discriminate against Black people. And that definitely shaped the history of our neighborhoods, and that definitely shaped the history of, how institutions and community centers and music and the jazz scene in Montreal developed, how much of that, unofficial segregation was in place. Of course, we know about Viola Desmond a little bit more because she's on our $10 bill more, and how she fought a similar fight in Nova Scotia. But I think, when we talk about our Black history, I think we often underestimate how much of that was actually just, you knew that there were some neighborhoods that you couldn't, even try to buy a house in, that it would just never be accepted, and people found ways around the fact that it wasn't written in law to be able to put in place the same kind of policies that were going on in the States. And I think this way of being able to say on paper that you didn't have them, but actually having them in place is also a form of gaslighting that, really doesn't help our communities and our youth when we're trying to figure out, where we stand in this country.
We have a couple of questions that were further up in the Q&A section. So I just want to give you two questions. One came from Jay Nair, saying, is there going to be a discussion of colonialism that started slavery and subjugation of the person of African descent? And the second came from Lisa Skeet, who says, our elders are maintaining our history in museums and archives for us, by us all over Canada, but we need funding for upkeep and preservation and restoration. Very true. How can we support, and what should we be doing?
First of all, the first question about, I'll start with the second question. That's very, very real. And I think wherever you are in this country, you will find those elders holding, the house on their shoulders, about like full of archives of pictures, underfunded, not well preserved, or kept in conditions that actually makes it hard for those archives to be preserved over time, or very hard to access for researchers. And that's actually a huge issue. I don't know what the CBTU can do about it, but in all of the institutions that you're a part of, I think that's something that's very concrete that could make a difference, is if those, you know, archive could be, I don't want to say give them to the states. I don't want to say that at all. I think it's good if they are in the hands of our communities, but actually, if they are, those folks are not only funded but also given opportunities to make that material accessible to the wider number of people. That's an issue that I think I'm not aware of any Black community in Canada that doesn't struggle with that. So thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a really important point. And it's also something that's like not too politically hot, in the sense that who can be against, you know, archives. So that's perhaps like a policy point that could be brought up to heritage that could actually be won like under this government, more than when we talk about, you know, police reforms and all that stuff. So yeah, so it's a real issue, but there might be some room for that to actually, you know, there could be some advancement made on that. The other question on the history of colonization and how our people, you know, got the way we were, I touched a little bit about it at the beginning. The focus on this was really to focus on Canada. And so this is why I'm not necessarily going into that, but all I can say is that that's the reason why, you know, that question is really important, and that I think it's fundamental to why it's so wrong to even trying to focus on those borders when we're trying to talk about Black history. Not only is the very fact that we identify as Black a produce of colonial and violence, colonial violence and slavery, the very fact of our identity is a product of that, as opposed to us, you know, having belonging to all of those basically First Nations on the continent, right? And some of us are, but some of us, that's just, you know, my last name is Nicolas, and Nicolas was probably the owner of some person in my ancestry, right? That's very real. And so oftentimes on this side of the Atlantic as well, our first language is, you know, a colonial language, right? Or we have Creole and Patois, and those languages are stigmatized even within our own communities, right? Because we want to advance, and we've like somehow believe that those languages are something that are, you know, that we've basically internalized the stigma. And so I think it's really important to just name that there's so many things that make, like everything that makes us a people is rooted into what is just an intergenerational genocide that shapes our relationship to land, how so many of us across the generation are just trying to go from place to place, trying to be safer than, not even safe, just safer than where they were before, is basically a lot of how you explain a lot of just migration patterns. And also to acknowledge that slavery itself not only shaped, of course, the faith of Black people here in the Americas, but also when they abolished, you know, the slave trade, so many, you know, of the political entities in West Africa had been reorganized around slave trade, people having to, you know, survive and to implement those systems and to deal with the European powers there. And so when you abolish slave trade, basically you abolish the economic system around which political powers in West Africa had been organized. And it's not an accident that when that happened at the beginning of the 19th century, there's very little years between that and, you know, the Berlin Conference and the start of that wave of colonization on the continent, where basically they were trying to erase and destroy as much as possible the existing, you know, political empires and entities that were there on the continent. And so that institution and shaped our faith here. It shaped our faith on the continent. And this is why sometimes that ignorance of our common faith shapes as well why so many conversations are so difficult sometimes in the Black community. And I was actually in Geneva last year. I've seen some of those conversations take place as well at the UN, because this is now the 6th or 7th year into that decade for people of African descent. And to get, you know, Black people from the different continents, different countries, to actually sit down and discuss, our common history, our common struggle. There's a lot of beautiful things happening, but there's also a lot of additional struggle that comes from the colonial erasure, that loss of memory, and that loss of shared resistance that we have. And because we don't know about each other's history, there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of caricature that we sometimes make for each other, and a lot of people internalizing power structures and reproducing within the community. Those things definitely have a huge impact on how we're able to organize as well internationally. And yeah, I just also want to say that it's important to name how colonization and slavery have impacted our identity, but because we often don't do it, not because we're not good, just because it's so hard to do within the structures that we live in. It also makes, you know, international solidarity amongst Black folks, both in Canada and globally, right? Just the understanding between folks who have different history, different identity, very difficult sometimes, and that actually sometimes hinders our capacity to fight for social justice. And so, you know, getting our history right is actually instrumental to our future.
Thank you. I have a question for you. And we kind of touched on this a little bit. I think it was before we actually started and we were just, you know, eating cookies and practicing. But there's a significant segment of the Canadian population, et surtout, je vais dire aussi, surtout ici au Québec, that holds firm that racism doesn't exist. There is no systemic racism here in Canada. Il n'y a pas de racisme du tout au Québec. Ben non, ça n'existe pas ici. Ça vient des États-Unis, cette notion-là. It's not from here. It's an American way of thinking. Based on the history that you just shared with us, and I mean, there's so much more, but there's only so long in the night. Based on what you shared with us tonight, how do you debunk this myth? Because I know that this is something that you tackle very often. For the rest of the group, how do you find that you attack that myth?
Me personally, there's a lot of things, but for example, there's a lot of Indigenous facilitators out there who struggle with a similar challenge. And oftentimes what they do, one of the most common exercises that they do, for example, in unions, when they do human rights training is, you know, the blanket exercise, when you map, like you visualize basically the land and how much it shrinks over time as policies are put in place by the Canadian state, and then you're stuck in this little corner of blanket basically, and you can see the land being taken away. So it becomes not just abstract history, but it becomes very real. In my own practice, what I try to do, instead of doing, you know, equity, diversity, inclusion workshop that are mostly about, you know, implicit biases and all of that, I try to also root myself in history and make people see the facts. They can argue with me all they want, but they cannot argue with the facts. And then I think when people know what they haven't learned in school, instead of directing that anger at Black people or directing that anger at me because I said something that challenges them. It's like, direct your anger at the Minister of Education that lied to you. Direct your anger at the media that did not also give you the information. Because I think the issue is that all of us don't have access to this history. I think for a lot of us who are Black, it's actually healing for us to learn more about that history and to learn the truth. It helps us be more connected to our ancestors. It helps us find our place in the world, and it helps us, find our purpose and how we can be ourselves better ancestors for the future generations. When it comes to people who are white or people who are racialized but are not Black, learning about that history can pose a personal challenge. And so there's resistance to basically facts and truth. But there will always be a part of folks who actually care about truth. And that with the right setting, when they know, they start, undoing that. But what you're alluding to, when it becomes also, there's the group think of if you're trying to talk about racism in Canada, or especially in Quebec, this is an attack on Quebec, this is an attack on Canada. Every week I have people telling me that I'm a racist against Quebecers because I talk about race. You get used to it. And I think it's important to keep going and to focus your mental energy on the folks that can learn and want to learn, because otherwise you're gonna burn. And also just know that this learning, first and foremost, is not just for, trying to turn people into allies. It's first and foremost for ourselves. As I was saying, like, when you don't know your history and you're subjected to all of that state violence, oftentimes if you grew up in Canada, you might not know your worth as a youth, right? And that gets into your head, and that gets into your self-worth. That's going to shape what you can dream for yourself or not, what you see yourself grow up to be or not. And it's really, really important, first and foremost, for our own communities to be able to do that work. And then I think if we do that work amongst ourselves, and then, white allies listening, that's great. But it's not, the success of our work doesn't depend on changing their mind. They depend on our youth being healthy. It depends on our youth being healthy and thriving and wanting to go ahead, and us being good, future elders to them. And then everybody else is just going to deal with that the best they can as well, So yeah, it's something that I've been, struggling or thinking about a lot for myself, how to focus or balance your energy better, because when you work a lot in the media, what you do usually is education of the public being assumed as white. But I think it's also important to just find that balance, because otherwise you go nuts. And I think it's important to preserve yourself, right? Before helping others, kind of like put your own mask first.
Thank you. Denise, are you able to unmute Derek Berry? He had his hand up. I believe he has a question.
I certainly can. Go ahead, Derek.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Wait, hi.
Hi, it's nice to hear what you have to say. That's been very, very educational and interesting. But do you think that some of the stuff that has been happening recently is more of a response to what we never did before in the last 20 years, as saying taking a stand, or maybe putting our voice forward more?
Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I'm thinking of some of the later things that have happened recently in Canada when it comes to carding and the things that we've seen in the newspaper being pushed forward by reporters, being pushed forward by the mainstream media. did we as Black folks in Canada, and have been one myself for a very long time, did we not give ourselves more of a voice because it wasn't an opportunity?
Yeah, well, from what I'm seeing from myself is that folks have been doing the work in the trenches, in the shadows, getting no recognition for years, generation after another, always, all the time. And often when there's no momentum to make any wins, you see, you know, who's there, who's there to stay, right? Because sometimes there's always going to be, for example, if you have a government in power that's, you can see that maybe you could, you know, make some gains that there, but sometimes there's folks as well, both municipally, federally, you know, or provincially, that you know that it's just, there's no way to even engage a dialogue or to do anything. And those, when people have a sense of despair, usually what you have is just the folks on the ground who are just there for the community, but there's no glory in that activism, right? It's just, usually it's women just there, just trying to hold the fort and
Very
help,
true, very
and
true.
help people. And then sometimes you have, you know, momentums, a lot of the times in Canada, because Canadian media and the mainstream only wants to talk about racism when it's a conversation about racism is happening in the United States. Sometimes we don't even control the momentum of how there's going to be more ways to, you know, get some white attention on the issues, or to change the consciousness of people who are not living in those realities, are not even close to living those realities.
Okay, well, now
And some,
you mentioned getting white attention.
right.
So
Yeah.
having been 7 generations Canadian Black, white attention we found was nothing that was ever available.
Right.
So if we are now looking at going forward today, and with everything I've heard today through what I've been watching for the last, hour and a half type of thing, I hear the same feelings that you're progressing towards us, that nobody is giving us the ability to go forward. And are we able to take it?
No, I'm seeing a lot of change actually. And I think just the fact that this space exists and that people are mobilized, and especially I think with the last year that we've just had, there's definitely room for, you know, campaigns to succeed. And I think it's really important to celebrate when those campaigns succeed. But this is a webinar about history. So of course I'm talking about the history and the history of struggle and the history of resistance as well.
Yes, yes.
But I do think that if the question is trying to fast forward to now, you know, people are not working for nothing. And it's not just the policy change and whatnot, it's just the very life that people are saving, making a difference with every day. I mean, yeah, we were just having Elle at the beginning of the reading her poem. I don't know how many people that Elle has like practically impacted by her activism. You know, people who were threatened of being deported who are just not deported because of the work that she's been doing and the work that others have been doing around her. I'm just naming her because she was there, but it's just so many ways that we can also, you know, celebrate our wins amongst, you know, or amidst the system. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that, once again, to not go nuts. That doesn't mean that the structures that I was naming about how it's always going to be a political battle to exist and to name the existence of Black folks here, because it's a fundamental challenge basically to Canadian nationalism and Canadian identity and Quebecois nationalism and Canadian identity to just look at the facts of who we are. It makes us inherently political subjects. It makes us two white narratives, hot potatoes that a lot of folks will not want to deal with. And I think it's important to name that. But there's also folks who want to deal with that. And there's also the fact that it doesn't matter that much because we are important enough for ourselves, right, as Black people, and that in our own communities, we can make a difference in our lives. And a lot of people underground are doing really important work that has a concrete impact on other people's life. And that is also a victory. Victory is not just dependent on, you know, the National Assembly or the House of Commons or Queen's Park or your Legislative Assembly or whatever that is. It's also whenever you get, you know, a Black youth to love themselves, that's like that's a victory. Whenever you get people to know where they come from and to find, you know, purpose because of that knowledge, that's a victory. And whenever you get people to be just have better housing, better work conditions, that's also a victory. And yeah, and I think sometimes the fact that there's always going to be a backlash, that's true. But it's also, you know, it's a matter, I think, of equilibrium for us to keep on doing what we want. And I think for myself, you know, thinking about all the generation that came before me that got through so much really, really helps me give courage when I have like the trolls and God knows who, you know, attacking me personally because I'm somewhat a public figure now. I always remember that like my ancestors ran Napoleon's army into the literal ocean, okay? Like they are not impressed by what's going on now. They are absolutely not impressed and they are there with me.
L'union fait la force.
That's right.
A little plug for you. We had a question. Thank you, Derek, for your question. We have a question that came in from, and I'm very sorry if I don't say this properly, Ushnish Sergupta. And the question is, are trade unions a colonial and Eurocentric form of relationship between labor and capital? Are there different Afrocentric or Indigenous relationships we should learn from? I love this question.
I really love this question too. And this is the kind of question that makes me just want to dig more and do more research for myself. But one thing I can say is that labor unions are a response to capitalism, basically. Capitalism happened, so unions happened. And so if you had a different economic organization, you would not have unions the way they exist now. They're basically a creature, or their response or a counter-revolution to you know, those companies owner trying to suck as much energy as possible from us. And so that's why I think if you have a completely different civilization that thinks of labor differently, that thinks of human activity differently, that thinks of our relationship to our trades and how we find purpose in what we contribute to our community in a way that has absolutely nothing to do with the economic capitalist system, then you also have a sense of solidarity and what it means to have labor that is also completely different. And so, yeah, we are basically, that's also one of the contradictions of like Black people in America, right? We're basically creatures of the West in many ways, like the West has created us, and then we're fighting that, and we're shaping our own lives within that. But something like the fact that Black union movement is so strong is and important, just speaks to that, just speaks to the fact that we're caught in this capitalist system, and then we'll find ways to reinvent ourselves and to recreate and to fashion ourselves within that actually is also poses very existential political questions to the West itself. But there are also absolutely, you know, when we look into our own heritage, just completely different ways of organizing and thinking about work and thinking about labor that I think could also really be inspiration for the work that we're all trying to do.
Thank you. And I have to go to the other screen to read this last question because it's too long for me to rewrite onto my sheet of paper. We have a question from Pat Dixon, and after that we'll have one last question that was sent in by Julia McRae, and we'll have to probably cut it there because we're already at 8:45. Pat Dixon's question: I read about Emmett Till in 1955, and because he was the same age as me, 14 at the time, I was horrified. I've been following the subject of racism ever since. It had been covered a lot in newspapers like the Montreal Star, Toronto Star, and others this whole time. Carding, racist behavior, etc., have been discussed ad nauseum. I suspect that education systems don't produce thoughtful people interested in society. It tends to produce conformists who'd rather read about sports, cars, business, celebrities, etc. Do you think that major changes in education are essential to erase racism? And ghettoization needs to be eliminated as well.
I think that's a wonderful question. And it goes back, I think it ties very well to the point that we were having before about just, it all goes back to capitalism. Schools are also a produce of capitalism. The fact that literacy became important to the state happened. Why? Because the economy started to change. When people were mostly working in agriculture, nobody cared that the people couldn't read and write, right? When people were just working in manufacturers as well, like literacy was not an issue. It's just when you started to trying to create basically a class of bureaucracy that then you started to be interested in people, you know, attending those schools and taking those trades. It was never necessarily just for the greater good that people were sitting in school. It was just, it makes you know, qualified labor, or, you know, people who have the skills to be able to work in the economy that we've been creating. And it also absolutely then creates, you know, conformism and all of that. And still today, there's always this debate going on about, you know, the fact that we need to make education more better yoked to the realities of the job market, right? How many politicians have you heard say that? While that's true, because people need jobs to be able to survive in the system that we live in, there's also the ideological construct, you know, behind that is very much about the fact that education serves you to be a productive worker, and that's the job of the education system. It's absolutely not to make you a citizen. It's absolutely not to make you, you know, be a critical thinker. If it can be about you being a citizen, but yeah, a citizen that's going to, you know, pay your taxes and just be good and just like vote once every 4 years. But if the goal was to make citizens that would be more engaged in democracy than vote every 4 years, then we would have a political system that demands also more out of people, right? And so there's that fundamental issue that is absolutely true when it comes to having impact on how we're taught about Black history, but it's true about a lot of things. It's true about the challenges of this century where folks are just not being able to recognize the difference between fake news and actual news and journalism and conspiracy theory. Why? Because, you know, we've been making sure that the skills that would make people, you know, be able to think critically were never the ones that have been valued. And even in our community sometimes, because there's so much, you know, poverty and people want to get out of poverty, we have this insistence on like practical degrees, and I understand where that comes from. But sometimes as well, it just creates as well a culture where we don't want to focus on the more abstract stuff that's actually essential to just our mental health, and so, and our artistic, you know, expression and all of that. And so yeah, so it's a huge question. Do we need an education reform? Absolutely. Do we need to make education more equitable and accessible as well? Absolutely as well. But there has been folks working on that generation after generation after generation. There's been people in the communities, especially women, once again, filling the gaps, doing after school programs and doing you know, community programs that would be you know, providing to Black kids the education that they don't get in the actual school system that they pay taxes for. So all of that work has been in place, and I think we can just, you know, build on that.
Thank you. I'll go back to the question section here to read Julie's question. Sorry, Julia's question. So Julia McCrae asks, have you heard of this campaign to address blacked out history? Dr. Nicole Westburn has put together a list of activities for educators to consider with regards to the blacked out history movement. In an ad for the campaign titled #BlackedOutHistory, the pages of history book that cover non-Black history are blacked out. The ad reveals out of 255 pages that make up the Nelson textbook, only 13 pages cover Black history. On a side note, my Brown history textbook when I was in grade 10 only had a paragraph. Natasha Henry, president of the Ontario Black History Society, said the purpose of the campaign is to raise awareness around how little Black history is taught in Canadian schools. I think it's more of a statement than a question, but it kind of goes towards the
really interesting initiative that I wasn't aware of. There's many people have been, trying to raise that point, and obviously every February people raise it again. And I think that's a really great initiative. So kudos to that prof for trying to highlight this message.
Absolutely. Well, on that, we lose translation in just a few minutes, so we do have to cut the questions there. I'm so sorry. I wished we had more time for questions for Emilie. Maybe if the Governor General nod doesn't go to her, then she'll have more time for us in future. We were all teasing as soon as we saw it come out. I said, "Oh my goodness, please don't go for that job until the 4th, because we need you on the 3rd." But no, seriously.
Did you imagine with everything that I just said represent British monarchy?
It would have been fantastic.
I don't think that's going to work. Yeah.
I think it's great that so many people did participate and had so many questions, and I'm very thankful that the translators were there. A big thank you to ELC for the translation services, and to the Public Servants Alliance of Canada for their assistance this evening. And off to you, Yolanda, to close out this session.
Great, thanks so much. Oh my goodness, I also want to do a couple of thanks. Oh, Emilie, I feel so much closer to you tonight than I've ever felt. This was really rewarding, I have to say, with your insight, your knowledge. You're sharing so much information, really puts us in a great place for our opening of our speaker series. I also want to thank you for sharing not just the stories, the information and the insight, but books, which are very practical. Sometimes we have these webinars and then we hang up and, like I said earlier, I know we go from webinar to webinar and sometimes we just don't take these things in, but you were very practical tonight. So the books were very helpful. The links that Ogo put in were very practical. And I know that it's on the chat that people were saying, thank you for them, thank you, which means I guess, folks will continue to do this good work along the side of the work that they are doing, whether they're unionized or not, doing community work or not. We know that everyone tonight got something out of the evening for sure. And thanks again for being a part of our opening series. I also want to thank Elle Jones, for her powerful spoken word that she did. Elle, we know that you're coming back, and so I thank you so much. I love you, my sister, very much. We spend lots of time together on panels, and I appreciate you every time I do see you. I learn so much from you. And I know that Isabelle thanks some folks, but it takes a lot of work to put this stuff together. In the background, all folks are doing this on the side of their tables, the side of their desks, after their work hours. And thank you to Ogo Akalo from the Ontario Federation of Labor and Denise Hampton for putting this together from the Public Service Alliance of Canada. I know we did thank our interpreters, but for the two of you, this is work. And I know you did it because you love what you do. And I thank you for being great supporters of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. I also wanted to thank CUPE for their work in allowing me to do this work. and being a part of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and not just lending me to them, but also being able to do this good work so that we can move forward. And in that note, I'm going to tell those of you that just came on later than others, we will be doing a series every week. We invite you next Thursday. We'll send out another invite next Thursday evening. We'll have another webinar moderated by our International Coalition of Black Trade Unions President, Terry Melvin, along with the Global Actions Workers Institute. So we'll have some folks from Africa and the States, Europe, and ourselves on a panel which Mark Brown will be on, if you know him from CUPW. And so we ask you to, put that in your calendars, and we'll send you the invite. That's just for next week. And every week we'll just tell you what's next. So thank you again. And for those of you that are not members of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, you can absolutely find us on Facebook, Twitter, and at www.cbtu.ca. Thanks, everyone. Did I forget anybody? I know the 4 of you are up there. I know you're looking at me probably like testing me or something. Did I forget anything? Are we all good?
We're all good.
Yeah, okay.
Just let me say thank you to my new sisters, Elle and Emilie, for saying yes. Thank you for saying yes. And I appreciate the sisterhood on this panel that I'm looking at right now, and the work that we've done together to lift up our people and to forward the work that we've been doing. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Thank you so much for sticking with us for so late. Thank you.
Bonne soirée.
See you next week.
Au revoir, merci. Bonne nuit.
Ooh, go ahead.